Your poems have a vigor to them and a sense of confidence that's buried in a soil positivity. So like they're very, very positive poems. And I wonder if that's always has been the case for you since the beginning, or that's something that you discovered and honed in later.
I think that positivity is something that I've always had in my poems and my work. And part of it is probably personality and my personal outlook. But I think some of it is also Islam and the general air of optimism that we're encouraged to carry with us.
Salam everyone, welcome back to Hazawi Podcast. Today I had the pleasure to speak to Rakaya, who is a award-winning poet. She's a facilitator and an event producer. She is a poet and a writer who writes a lot about identity, about faith, Islam, culture, self-affirmation, and she has a master's degree in creative writing. I highly recommend watching her performances on YouTube, which I will link below. She's been commissioned by organizations like the BBC, like Facebook, Instagram. In the conversation, we talked about everything from being a third generation immigrant to her poetry, the craft. She talks about her editing process and her writing process, as well as the way to tell stories in conversation versus the way we tell stories in the page. This is an exciting episode, and I'm sure you will value the things that we spoke about. You will extract a lot of insight. In the meantime, enjoy and stay creative. Rakaya, thank you so much for coming on Hazawi Podcast. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here talking to you.
I thought to delve into your sort of inspiration for poetry. How did poetry became part of your life? Was it a book that inspired you in the early on, or was it someone that you know?
I think it was a mix of both for me. So I had quite a creative upbringing. So my dad was very involved in artistic things. He was a rapper and a DJ even at points before his conversion to Islam. And he would always take me around to different events and things. So I would be inspired by loads of people around me. And from a very early age, I was able to see poet performers who were Muslim and didn't have to compromise their faith for their art, and the two kind of work together very well. So there's a group when I was growing up called Poetic Pilgrimage, and the two of them are poets at the moment, working poets, but they had a big impact on me when I was growing up. And then also just general poets like Maya Angelou, I think, was the first poet that I remember listening to and having an emotional response to her words, and her performance as well. I think performance kind of was a big part of what inspired me when it came to poetry, the start of my journey.
Yeah, I struggled a couple of years ago to reading poetry. I grew up reading a lot of Arabic poetry, and Arabic poetry is like performative. That's how I was introduced to it. Whether it's by like my grandfather, when we would sit around like in the afternoon, and they will literally just freestyle poetry about like the weather or about the season or about each other. And that's how I was introduced to poetry early on. And then when I grew up, I didn't really read poetry, but listening to like poets on YouTube and in competitions in like the Middle East, there's a lot of like poetry competitions. That was how I was introduced to it. But then after moving to the US and learning how to read English, I struggled with accessing English poetry, because all was there for like the language and me and like the text, and that was very hard for me to access. But then listening to folks, sort of made it easier to understand. But then even listening to you and listening to the poems that you have performed like on YouTube, how do you cultivate that type of confidence? Because for you, it's not like a speech. It's literally like a performance, and the words and the storytelling in the poem, they like go hand in hand with like your hand gestures. It was like this everything. Like, how do you get to that point?
Yeah. Oh, interesting that you mentioned kind of your upbringing and watching Arabic poetry. I feel like there is something to do with culture as well, because like I've got a West African background and we have the whole griot culture where it's very performative storytelling and oral tradition is very kind of strong in that culture. And I feel like I definitely see that when it comes to American poets and also Arab poets. Like you can see the expression is all very big. But when it comes to like British UK poetry, it is like a little bit more understated. And I think I am somewhere in between with my work as well. Like I do have that performance quality. And I actually grew up like in young youth theaters and things like that. And I did a lot of drama and I was comfortable kind of on stage. So I brought bits of that into my poetry. But I did find when I started first sharing poetry, I was so nervous and it was really daunting to share something that is so exposing, I think. Because on stage, if I was like acting as a character, you're very hidden behind the character. Whereas when you're sharing poetry, it's more of a it's a very personal thing and that can be scary. But yeah, I think drama definitely informed how I tell stories and how I read poetry.
You mentioned earlier the importance of your faith within your poetry, and I noticed throughout all your poems, or like most of them, there are a few overlapping themes. Faith is part of it, identity is another, culture is also another, and I am wondering, how do you approach all those themes in your work, and what impact do you hope for them to have in your audience?
I think I really love to connect to art in its different forms that is very specific to a person and to a context, because I feel the more specific you are, in a way, the more relatable it is. Because once you get closer to the person and their world, then you're able to relate it to your own specific cultures and contexts and things that you have going on. So yeah, I feel like I want my poetry to always have some of my truth in it. And to do that, I put in different parts of my identity that, especially with faith, like I might be writing something that isn't specifically religious, but my faith will inform my outlook on the world and how I interact with things and how I interact with people. So I feel like an element of that is always present. Yeah.
There's a line that you reminded me of, I think is in your poem box. And I mean, the way you set it up is very elegant because you start with I am, and then there are like a sequence of defining factors of who you are, and like they like move in time, space, and culture, which was like amazing. But one line that really stood out for me was you say I am in the beginning, and it goes, I'm the third generation, more lost than the second, but free enough to write poems. Could you reflect on that line and what it means to you, or what inspired you to write it?
Yeah, I think that line was about, so it was kind of referring to my heritage. And so my grandparents came to the UK in the 60s, and my parents were born here and then raised me and my brothers here as well. And I feel like each generation has its different kind of priorities and freedoms and also trials. Like the things that my grandparents went through, my parents didn't go through, and the things my parents went through, we didn't go through. And they've definitely set up the foundation so that our lives in this country are a lot easier. And because of that space that we have, I think that we're able to do more reflection. We're able to, write poems about it. We're not just about kind of the grind or survival. But we have that space for, grace and reflection. So that's what I was talking about in that line, but also more lost than the second generation. Because so my family's from Ghana and Nigeria, and between my grandparents, there's like 3 native languages, and they all spoke many different languages, but 3 that are like their ethnic languages. And I don't have any of them. Like I've got phrases in my maternal grandma's language. But then when it comes to the other ones, there's a lot been lost. A lot has been lost. And, I've come to accept that I am a British in some kind of way, even though I feel like everyone in this kind of British diaspora has a, love-hate relationship with the country and with its history. So there's a reluctance to kind of fully take on and accept that as a title, and we'll always have our heritage. But yeah, I do accept that I'm not as West African as someone else might be. So yeah, it's a negotiation of cultures and identities there.
Yeah, it's fascinating that you mention it because in America, especially for the Yemeni community, which is where I'm from, we don't necessarily have, at least from the people I know, and I live in New York City, so I know a lot of Yemenis. I don't think I know someone who is a third generation. And our parents came early on, probably also like in the 60s, but the idea was never to stay. So my grandfather probably came in the 70s. My father came in the 80s, but I didn't arrive here, or my family didn't migrate fully until like 2007. My father always, I remember as a kid, my father would come like during the summers and would travel back and work for, the whole school year, sometimes even for 2 3 years, and then come and spend a couple of months with us. And I was always like, back home, they would always call me the son of the American father. And that gave me some sort of like, status, but like not necessarily because people thought that we were rich, but we were like really not. I mean, the reason that my dad could not bring us here because he couldn't maintain a family here. So like looking at my experience here as an immigrant is exactly that. Like my struggle with like writing and trying to not even convince people, trying to explain to people why is it valuable to like hold on to storytelling, hold on to culture in text form, like in story form, is almost a language that I can't find to communicate it to them. So the struggle is still, all right, is this gonna make you money, like a ton of money? If it is not, then why do you see value in it? My conversations with my dad, I mean, at this point, he accepts it, and like we've never had a problem about it. But it's hard for him to appreciate like storytelling and writing books and writing poems, unless there is like a number attached to it. And it's not only my dad, like his whole generation is like that. So it's very interesting to like know like maybe my daughter and like my future children would be like, have an easier time with like the arts.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And I feel like it is something that we might resent a little bit, that generation, just asking us to be doctors and lawyers. But at the same time, there's wisdom in it. There's reason in what they're asking us for, They want to know that we're taken care of and that we'll be able to, stabilize a family in a new space. So like there's reason for it, but I think as the generations go on, things will change. And I mean, the world is changing. Like what I'm doing now, I didn't actually think I would be able to do like as a job kind of thing. So a few years ago, I didn't think that what I'm doing now could be a job for me. Like I didn't even know that there were other creative pathways other than like just being an author of books. But there were other creative things that are related to writing and related to creativity and arts that you can do, and that can be a job for you as well. So yeah, I think as time goes on, the uncles and aunties will be more lenient and things will change. New generations of aunties and uncles will probably have some more open minds.
Your poems have a vigor to them and a sense of confidence that's buried in a soil positivity. So like they're very, very positive poems. And I wonder if that's always has been the case for you since the beginning, or that's something that you discovered and honed in later.
I think that positivity is something that I've always had in my poems and my work. And part of it is probably personality and my personal outlook. But I think some of it is also Islam and the general air of optimism that we're encouraged to carry with us. Like that saying of if the world is ending and you're planting a seed, just carry on planting your seed. Like there's always hope. There's always something that could grow out of this, even if it's the worst situation. So I think I like to include that in a lot of my poetry, and probably as a comfort to myself as well. I want to know that things can be better, and I like to dream for better, even with entertainment. When it comes to me as a consumer of entertainment, I'm not really like, if I want to hear about an awful history, I'd rather someone tell me about it, or I'd rather, read an article, rather than like reading a novel or watching a film that's gonna drag out something horrible, because I think the world has enough difficulty. So if we could like leave entertainment for some kind of escapism or hope, or an aspirational place, then that's great. But I also recognize that there are some things that need to be said that is not about comforting people. Some things have to be provocative, or, looking for a way to challenge when challenge is necessary. But yeah, I think for my own comfort, I do love to include that air of positivity.
Tell me if I'm wrong. I guess what we're talking about really is voice. And was there like a defining moment that shaped that voice for you? Or was it something that you just found unique about yourself and you leaned more on it? Because I'm just wondering about how do poets, writers find their voice? Because in the beginning, most of the time, it's sort of a trial and error type of process before you really like hold on to like this is how I approach subjects and this is the lens I speak through about them. How do you find that space?
I think it is, like you said, it is trial and error, just seeing where your voice fits. And part of that is probably feedback as well. The response that you're getting from a particular type of voice. And yeah, I think people do enjoy my lightheartedness and my humor and my optimism when it comes to my work. And I probably have, whether consciously or unconsciously, leaned into that as well as a result of the response. But I think I also find joy in that. I find joy in writing it. I find joy in sharing that. So following joy is probably a way to, I could say following comfort, but I don't think that's the best thing to say to a writer, because I think we've all got our kind of habits and grooves that we might get into that might be counterproductive to growth. But it's a balancing act, I guess, from finding your voice and still embracing creativity and newness.
How do you find people who critique your own writing?
Yeah, interesting one. Because I think it depends on who's critiquing and what their ulterior motives are. Because I've had some critiques that I'm like, I think you just want to take me down a peg. And I think as an artist, you have to also find some kind of confidence in your work where you're like, actually, no, that doesn't need to change. That's just me. That's just who I am. That's just what I want to be there. And this is my choice. And you have to be careful who you're taking advice from. But at the same time, I love to get critiqued. And I've kind of grown up as a writer in spaces of positive critique. I'm sure like you've had similar things with the masters. Like my masters was like workshops all the time. So everyone's reading your work and like tearing it apart and giving you important questions that you need to ask. And I had one teacher who would literally just take a red pen and he would just cross out words from the page, which was actually incredible because he didn't really add to it. He would just remove excess and leave what was vital to the page and what was actually giving something necessary and interesting and moving. So I love that kind of thing. I love being able to find something new in my work that I didn't see there, or hone in on something, or asking the right questions to try and make it better and to challenge me. Sometimes I go on writing retreats with one of my friends, Manira, and she gives me a lot of advice as well. And she once told me that because I got some feedback like from an editor, and I was like, yeah, I don't know if I want to change the work at this point. And she was like, is it because you think it's good enough, or is it because like you feel too lazy to to write anymore? Because if it's the second one, then you should go back and work harder on it, you know? And I think I need that sometimes, just that push to try and be better and work harder. Yeah. So I love good criticism, and I'm learning to overlook and not take to heart criticism that comes from a wrong place.
That's a very good friend that you have, because that question I feel like it's such a smart question to ask, especially at the point where you are at the fence of whether you should take a critique and edit it, or you know, take your pride and be like, oh no, I'm better than this. You took me back to workshop days. I don't know. Workshop was very interesting place to be in. I haven't had a workshop with like a professor or a teacher in about like a year and a half, and it feels too comfortable at this point. I feel like I need that rigor again. But then at the same time, I don't know if I miss it because it was sometimes it just got brutal. Yeah, sometimes it got really brutal. Do you now still go to workshops, or is it just writing retreats and sharing your stuff with your friends?
Yeah, I do. So I actually when I finished my master's, I was in a workshop group with other people from the course, and we carried that on for some time. And recently, I've just connected with another writer, and just one on one, we kind of workshop each other's work, or yeah, read and review each other's work. And I do find it really helpful, even just knowing someone else's writing to kind of push me forward and yeah, encourage me to write more. I'm writing fiction at the moment, but because it is such a kind of long and lonely process, especially compared to poetry, which you can just get on stage and share with like a room full of people and talk about it, it really helps me, I think, to have someone I know I'm gonna go back to, and we're gonna talk about this and we're gonna review this, and to just do the work is really helpful to have someone else.
I'm curious, what were the criteria you were looking at when you chose that person to do the one-on-ones with, or was it just like a friend that you happened to like their work and you know had like some sort of like eye for editing eye or whatever it is? Was there like a criteria, or you just stumbled upon them?
There wasn't a criteria actually. So yeah, this one person that I've been working with recently, I had actually never read her work before. But we actually met in like a Quran memorizing group. And like our friend said, oh, you know, you're both writers and that kind of thing. And we were just like, yeah, let's do this. But also, this is the first person, okay, other than like one teacher actually, but this is the first person who is like my peer, who is also Muslim and also Black, who I've had reading my work and I'm reading their work and we're critiquing each other. So, you know, obviously like the UK higher education is like, you know, it gets less and less diverse as you go up. And in my class, it was a very small class, but there were only 3 people of color and I was the only Muslim. So it's very interesting because also what I was writing was uh from my viewpoint, from my perspective, the characters were Muslim, the characters were West African. Um, and there was a lot of explaining to be done through the workshop. So it's interesting to now have a space where we're already starting from a level of familiarity. So there's certain things that won't be questioned, and you know, you can get straight to the critique, to the work, to what needs to be worked on.
I'm very glad that you're writing fiction. I write fiction, and I can't wait to read your fiction. I don't have that skill to write poetry, but I wonder, how do you approach the question of audience now, especially since you've performed and you've done work that have exposed your personality, you put yourself out there. who do you write for now, and has it changed over time?
Okay, so there's an interview with Toni Morrison, where she's talking about her audience and the fact that she's really not writing for the white gaze. She's writing about Black people and for Black people, and she's very unapologetic in that. Um, and so that is kind of a space that I would aspire to, but it's very hard. I think coming from, this context of, especially like, I feel like America, I don't know about America now, but yeah, I don't want to generalize about America, but I feel like the context that I live in is very mixed. I feel like I don't live in a homogenous society, and I don't even live, like, even not even my area or like the schools that I went to or my friend groups, we're not all the same. So it would be very bold for me to be like, oh, I'm writing for Ghanaian Muslims, or even I'm just writing for Black people, or even I'm just writing for Muslims. I think primarily, I don't want someone like me reading my work to feel excluded. I don't want them to feel like, oh, I'm talking over them right now to like the white person who's sitting behind and I need to explain that. I don't want them to feel like, the focus has moved from them as my audience. But at the same time, I know that I'm not just writing for them. So it is a hard space. It's difficult. And I've read books where I'm like, oh, like they're doing so much explaining here, and that wasn't necessary. And I feel like when I was on my course as well, I did have to push back on that. Like, when I'm told to put things in italics or like give a little explanation, or why is this spelt this way, and that kind of encouraged me to like double down a little bit more. Like, no, actually, you can Google this. Like, it's fine. Or you can just let it wash over you and gather what you can from the rest of it. But yeah, audience is an interesting one. Another ideal that I would have is that I'm not thinking about audience when I'm writing. Like, I'm just telling a story without thinking about anyone who may or may not read it in the future. But yeah, again, that's like the ideal. It's not where I am. And also, I feel like writing within workshop context kind of prevents you from having that pure, I'm just writing a story energy, because next week all these people are going to read your work and be crossing stuff out and adding stuff in. So it's very hard to have the disconnect from an idea of potential readership. But in an ideal world, I would have that. I would just be writing a story.
You're completely right about like writing during workshop, that you tend to write towards the expectations of what you think people expect from you. I definitely fell for that a few times while writing in workshop. But also thinking about the journey that I've gone through with my writing, I feel like I had the opposite sort of realization. When I started, I would italize a lot more. I would overwrite a lot more because I want people to sort of have access to the stuff that I was talking about. And then one of my professors, workshop leaders, like pushed me against that, and he told me, you gotta like stop doing this. Like you don't owe it to no one to explain what a specific Arabic word is, or what a cultural understanding is. If people wants to read it and they enjoy it, they'll read it. Otherwise, they'll move on to the book that relates to them or they feel like they relate to. So you don't owe it to nobody. So I sort of had the opposite experience. The tricky thing about being in America is that is very mixed here. New York City the reputation is that is a melting pot, but the readership, most people that read are white. I remember going to this book launch of the author was white. The protagonist was actually someone from Yemen. It was like a nonfiction book of a Yemeni entrepreneur that did this great thing, and the book was all about the Yemeni person. So like the book was literally written about Yemen, Yemeni culture, and it was depicted like accurately. It was, and I mean, the writer is a very, very well-known great writer. But in the book launch, I was the only person of color. Never mind the only Yemeni or
Mm.
the only Muslim. I was the only person of color, and like I think um, there were maybe at least like 150 people, at least, and they were all white. And not that like I hated for that to happen, like is whatever. But then that's the market. So as an author, I mean, yes, you do not want your sort of community and the people that you're writing about to feel like they're being overlooked. But then the tricky part is that will your book get sell, like will you sell books? All right, will you maintain a roof above your head because of the way you write? And I think the question is just write whatever you think is authentic to yourself and to that represent your community. I mean, the thing that I always tell myself, if my mom would read this, and my mom is not going to read my books because she doesn't read English, but then if she does, would she be embarrassed? And that's sort of like my test, because I would never want her to be embarrassed. And for me, it's the opposite. Like I'm gonna write stuff that my mom would potentially be proud about if she can read it. And so that's always in my mind. Like even like sometimes I would add like a curse word, and for me it's like, all right, would my mom be proud of this? And if it is yes, then is someone like, the character would be like, I don't know, for example, like a soldier who like curses a, in colonial South Yemen, then like is understandable, as opposed to like having an imam curse just because I want to be like, present a shiny
Different.
object. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so what you said about the that book launch, I feel like for that is the case a lot, but I think that is on the writer and the publisher and the venue that hosted that event for not getting people of color in and not getting Yemeni people in. I don't think it's because Yemeni people wouldn't be interested in that. I think it's more their job of how do you reach these people? And they've spent so long only focusing on white audiences that they now don't know how to connect. So I feel like we shouldn't just write for the people that are already there. We need to write for the like untapped kind of spaces and people who haven't been reached. Because then it's like a whole new market.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you mentioned that, because I feel like the person that I'm talking about, and like I'm being very intentional about not mentioning names because I don't want it to come back to me because I really like the guy. Um, he is well known in the Yemeni community, and people are proud of his journey. They're very, very proud of his journey, very proud of like what he has done, and he's sort of like a revolutionary young man in the world of business. But I feel like, yes, this is something that I did not think about, but when you mentioned it, it made me think about like the way we do marketing for certain communities, and it's all at the end of the day a sort of cost benefit analysis. So we invite the people, or we target the people that we know are most likely will buy the book, will value getting it signed, as opposed to like giving access to who's this book for. So that's a very, very interesting insight.
Yeah, it's definitely a difficult balance. It's definitely a difficult balance.
Um, I wanted to talk about the role of vulnerability in your poetry, and you give a lot about your personal life, and your personal experiences, and that sort of the how specific you are tends to be the thread that people sort of hold when they want to relate to your experiences, even though they did not have your experience. I'm thinking about the poem Coconut. It's such an amazing poem because the image that I have in my mind, and I want to come back to this to ask you a question about storytelling, but the image that I have in my mind is the line where you talk about how you were standing in a street in Nima and buying coconut, and it reminded you of a street in London, I guess. But there, the coconut is like 650, and but they have straws. And it reminded me of my first trip back to Yemen, after moving here and staying for, I think, 8 years. And it sort of felt like I was there as a tourist. Like, I did not feel like the Yemen that I left. I sort of had this layer that surrounded me that people built because I just traveled to this other place and came back. So I was treated different. I was always offered to sit at the front seat of the car. I was offered the best seat in the majlis, or like the seating area where we sit in the afternoon. Um, and only because I've traveled to this place, they gave me status that I didn't necessarily deserve. So that whole experience prevented me from tapping into not even the person that I was when I left, but the experience that I had when I left. And it did feel at some point that I was like, this feels like I'm a tourist. And sort of that poem, that's how I related to that poem. And the question that I want to ask is, how do you navigate between sharing about your personal experiences and maintaining a sense of privacy?
Interesting. And thank you for sharing your stories about traveling back home as well, because it's very interesting. It feels like it's quite lonely because like home changes every time we leave. Places don't stay the same. Places aren't kind of stuck how we remember them. And then all we have is like the memory of that time. So it's like you're never kind of up to the moment, like with how it actually is. But yeah, sharing my personal stories and things from my life, I feel like, I only share so much. I only share what I'm comfortable sharing. And sometimes there are things that I can't even write about. Like it's too close and it's too much. And I can't even write it. And then there are things that I write that I won't share. But then there are personal things that I share. Like I've got a poem about my great aunt, and the last time I saw her, which was after my grandmother's funeral. And like that was like a very highly emotional time for me. And in the moment of writing it was as well. But I feel like after it was on the page and it was in my memory and it was like out in performance space, there's kind of a distance that happens. It's like I'm not in that moment anymore. I'm not in that emotional moment. And I'm not in the same space. But that also just reminds me that there have been times when I've read my own poem and seen like someone else's emotional reaction to it, and that has like made me cry. And it's like I'm hearing it for the first time and I'm traveling back to that point of writing it or that experience, because most of the time I'm quite disconnected and it is performance, and it is there's that space in between. But yeah, I think it is important to have a bit of vulnerability and a bit of, there has to be truth in it or people won't listen, and they won't relate to it. But there's a space, I think. I'm generally like quite a reserved person, so there's always some kind of space. And also another thing actually is that I write poems for people and about people, and I won't share it with them. And I've had like, my mom is notorious for like sending people my poems, like, okay, I wrote this about you, which is something I wouldn't usually do. And even like I was traveling recently, last summer, I was like interrailing around Europe on the trains, and I met these people who really just like took me in. And I wrote a poem for one of them about a difficulty that she was going through. And I shared it with someone else who was not her. And they were like, send it to her. Like, she's really going to appreciate this. But I feel like, yeah, in the writing, it's just, you're not in that human communication. And yeah, it can be quite separate. But once you kind of take it off the page and into real life, that's when, yeah, it's a different thing.
Yeah, I feel like we write and then we have a perception of the thing that we write, but then once it's out there, it has a very different life. It almost has a life of its own, and it grows in ways that we did not expect. Um, I wrote this story. Is my first published story that I published recently. It's a short story, and is about the Yemeni experience in airports. So Yemenis or the TSA at JFK are notorious at like stopping Yemenis at airports and just interviewing them about their trip and asking all these weird questions because Yemen is one of the sort of blacklisted countries. There are, I think, 7 of them. And so every time I go outside or through JFK, I'm always questioned. And it's always like a random check. That's how they label it. And so I wrote a story about this TSA agent who's black, and she's just following procedure and stops this um, Yemeni young man who comes from Yemen for the first time because he won a lottery visa. And so the response been interesting in that story because my like colleagues who have like found it online at work have like, oh, like one of them said, oh, you're writing about me, like this is my personality. um the other main character who is the TSA agent, I'm like, it's totally not you. um but again, and there's another person who's from my community. He's actually Hispanic, and his name was Mustafa, and the main character in the story, his name is Mustafa. So he read the story and he comes to me, he's like, you were writing about me. I'm like, dude, you're Dominican. Oh, this is a Yemeni guy. It's totally not about you. But that process is interesting because it really does, stories, poems, stuff that we create, they have their own life once they're published. And like the distance is weird because now I look back at that story and I'm like, would I have changed anything in it? Like, and the answer is immediately no. But I feel like other people's perception of it sort of like affects how I feel about it too.
That is such a big thing with fiction and even with poetry. Like I've had people contact me to be like, is this about me?
Yeah.
When it's really not. And I feel like with fiction, I do worry about people seeing themselves in the work. And then also, there was a point when I was like, I don't want people to think this is me and this is, I'm writing autobiographical like fiction. But at the same time, I feel like there is always going to be ourselves in the work we create, even when it's fiction. And there's going to be people from our world. There's going to be people that we've met and personalities that we've seen. Maybe not like someone with the same name and someone with the same job, but it's definitely going to be, our world is definitely reflected in the fiction. So I'm trying to also lean into that because that's where, the truth is. And we'll see if like I get sued later on in life.
um
But for now, it's fun.
uh yeah, I like, my wife is always my first reader when I write stuff, and it's funny because like fiction is, especially fiction, is literally a reproduction of your own experiences, and they might not be necessary about like a mirror of your own experience, but there's some like aspects that seeps in. So I was writing one time about this aunt who is very mean, and my wife reads up on it and she's like, is this your aunt? And I'm like, no, like she might have like a trait of like who my aunt is, but totally not. But like I feel safe because my aunt would never read my work. But at the same time, it's like, all right, if she could read my work, would I be able to write this character? And it's like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard because you don't want to offend anyone. And I feel like once it's on the page, even if you're writing literally about someone and it's their whole personality and it's how you've imagined them, once it gets to the creative space, it's gonna be different. Like it's gonna
Yeah,
be interpreted differently. In everyone's minds, they're gonna have a different person, and the creativity will make its own person from it. You're just kind of starting from that root of something or someone, but it's gonna change.
hearing about you writing fiction feels natural to me because your poems have a lot of storytelling in them. The way I imagine poetry is that they are a very powerful vehicle to articulate emotions that we struggle to put them in words. But your poems have like an add-on, like a an extra layer that has that storytelling element. I wonder what that means for your work, and how do you think about storytelling within your poetry?
I think that I love stories. I was writing fiction, I think, before I was writing poetry, actually. Poetry was something that I kind of did because there were like poetry competitions at school and I wanted to enter. But fiction was like always something that I turned to. I just love storytelling. And I love TV and I love stories in loads of different forms. I love theater as well. So yeah, I think I'm always looking for a good story. And in life as well, I feel like that's one of the best parts of like friendships, being able to gather together and tell a good story. And within stories, there can be hidden so much, there can be so much knowledge that is just put into this fun and creative thing, but there's something that you can take away and reflect on and, maybe even make you a better person. So there's definitely power in storytelling and the escapism that it gives you. So yeah, I try to bring that into my poetry as well. I think also I feel like there could be something about not having the confidence to ponder, or maybe not confidence, but feeling like my words are more worthwhile if I'm telling you what's happened and what's been observed and what I think about this specific thing that's happened than just the grander ideas or emotions. I feel like a purely emotional poem, if I was to write it myself, would feel too self-indulgent. So I would rather tell you a story where there's other people involved than like just be like telling you about this one emotion or telling you about this one idea I have. Yeah, that's kind of a half-cooked thought, but that's something.
It makes a lot of sense. I always like in my job. So my job has to do a lot with like standing before people and like leading, not writing workshops, about like a lot of trainings that has to do with education. And I always use storytelling as a mean to sort of communicate with the audience, connect with them, and people tend to be impressed about like this skill. And I keep telling everyone that sort of comes and comments on the way I do things on stage that you can do this too. Like everybody has it. They're like, no, but you have like a lot of story to tell. I'm like, yeah, everybody has stories to tell. It's like the way you shape them. And they almost don't believe me. And then also my wife sometimes like she doesn't believe me when I tell her this. And then recently I was telling a story to my brother who came over of a recent trip that we took to Turkey, and it was the first time we rented a car, and it was exciting, but at the same time, it was a little bit scary because we didn't know how like the parking worked, how like the sort of like roads were, and so we rented a car, we drove around for a little bit, and like I found it easy. So like my wife was sort of like the navigator, I was like the driver, and like she'd like take a left and I'll take a left, and it was like we developed a system when we got it, and like the roads were very very clean and easy to understand. And then in one of the days, we got to the middle of in highway, and our tire started losing air. And so like now the car is beeping and it's telling me that you're losing air. And so like I park on the shoulder of the road and I get off the car. I look at the back tire and it's almost empty. So I started panicking because it was a Sunday. Everything was closed. And so the only idea that I come up with is I'll call the sort of like the rental place and tell them like to help me, because like I don't know where to go or how to deal with this here. And so my immediate thinking was like maybe the next step is to change it to the spare tire and drive until like I find somewhere to replace the tire that I have on the car. So I call the guy, and he tells me just find a gas station and then see if they have a sort of like mechanic shop in it, because that tends to be the thing. Then I'm like, all right. So we drive a little. We drive up maybe half a mile, and we see a gas station. There's actually a mechanic there. Like I park my car inside the mechanic shop. He tells me that he's gonna fix it, and so I'm very excited that I can actually get this fixed on a Sunday where I didn't think it was gonna get fixed. And so he fixes it, and he charges me like $4, which is nothing compared to like what I would pay in America, and I was very excited. So like now he fixes it, I'm back in the car, we're excited, we're about to hit the road because we have another 1 hour drive to our next Airbnb. And as I'm backing up, boom, I hit another car. And so I get off, and just like a bunch of people just come around and look at what I've done. And I literally just dented the back of the other car. It went all the way inside. My car had like a very, very light scratch, but the other one was just like, the backlight was also broken. It just did not look good. And now everybody's talking to me in Turkish, and I'm telling them like, I don't understand what you're saying. And one of them is like yelling at me, and later I found out he was the owner. And we got into this situation where he was like taking pictures of me, taking pictures of the car. He's like, I want to call the police. I'm going to call the insurance company. And I'm like, no, if you call the insurance company, it's going to be really, really bad. And I did not want the insurance company to get the notice, because they would charge me like a ton of money. They were already warning me, if I break the headlight, they were going to charge me like $1,000. I mean, it was crazy the way their system is set up. Eventually, I talked to the person, and we reached a deal. I gave him money cash. We did not call the police, and we dealt with it. And we moved on with our day. I was telling this story to my brother, and he was like amazed. Now, his wife comes later that same day, and he's telling me, "Oh, tell that story that you just told. You just told me earlier." My wife is like, "No, I'ma tell it. You know what happened to us in Turkey? A tire got popped in the middle of the road." And I'm like, that's it. You killed the story. And what I'm trying to say in all this is that we all have stories, and we have the ability to shape them in ways that can be exciting, or we can just like start with the end and have like build no suspense, build no drama, and not make them as rewarding as they would be if you just tell the details, delay the sort of like the punchline, what comedians would call, or like the climax, what story writers would call, until the very, very end. So everybody has stories. We are the ones who have to choose how we tell them.
That is so true. That is so true, and a great example of it as well. I feel like it's interesting because it does take confidence to tell a story. And it's something that I feel like young people and women have been like socialized to not do, to not have the confidence to do. Like with my younger brother, I've got three brothers, and there's the middle one. Sometimes he would like start a sentence and just end it with, never mind. And it's like, no one interrupted you. You need to finish that story. You need to finish that sentence. You need to tell me what you're trying to say. And I feel like I have been quite similar to that. And even sometimes now, depending on the environment that I'm in, will like cut a story short, or like fluff up in the middle, or it is a skill, I think, storytelling. And I also think that poetry is a great space for planning your story. So you're able to tell it in its entirety how you want to tell it, and not worry about being interrupted or boring people or whatever it is. So yeah, poetry is a really wonderful space for that kind of storytelling.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you mentioned your brother, because I also have a younger brother. He's 12, and he has that exact same habit. He will start a sentence and he would say the exact same phrase, never mind. And my younger brother, or the middle brother, he would always like, hold him accountable for that. Like, no, like finish what you were about to say. Like you're not gonna be harmed. Nobody's gonna be offended. And most of the time is his own insecurity or his perception of what we would think about him if he shares what he thinks would like make him look bad. So yeah, it's definitely like a thing that you have to be intentional on, like either like, you know, offering space for stories to be told without, you know, any ramifications, and like sort of giving people the space to build their confidence. But it's totally a confidence and a skill thing. But everyone has stories. There's my argument.
I agree. I definitely think everyone has stories. Yeah. Being able to tell them.
As a facilitator and now mentor for young writers, what advice or guidance do you find yourself sharing the most with writers and poets? Is there a common misconceptions or pitfalls that you try to address? What advice do you give young people?
I think advice that I give everyone is to one, write a lot, like fill notebooks with writing, just write as often as you can. And also something that I've been told by a lot of successful writers is to write every day. And I have not mastered that skill, but definitely to write a lot. And then the other one is to just stay close to your inspirations, to keep consuming art in its different forms and stay inspired. I think that's really important to being able to grow as a writer. But yeah, I work with a lot of different people, and some of them don't consider themselves to be writers at all, especially going into schools with that kind of middle teenage age, because there are children who will, just the excitement of doing something new, they're happy to try. But at a certain age, people kind of shut themselves off and say, oh, I'm not a writer, I'm not good at this, I'm not good at that. So also just giving yourself the space to be bad at something, to be a beginner, and to improve and embrace the art of editing, because that's something else that kids do not like to do. They don't like to read back on their work and improve it. They're just like, okay, I did a thing, like that's it. But actually half or more than half of writing is the editing, and it is the refining and making it better. So yeah, being able to do that is a really good thing. And then something that I often start workshops off with is a free write, where you're just writing whatever comes to mind and trying not to stop writing for a set period of time. So it might be a minute or 5 minutes or however long, but to just write what is coming to your mind, even if you're repeating yourself, or you know it's very boring, or it doesn't really make sense, but to just keep going until your mind takes you somewhere else. And I think that is really useful for people who can find it easy to overthink and get lost in the pressure of making something sound good. And that's definitely a space that I find myself in a lot, that you'll get, you know, kind of blocked, writer's block, because you want it to be great the first time round, when you should just embrace the fact that it's not. It might be very mediocre, it might be bad, but you can build from there.
You mentioned two things. One of them was and I have a newsletter that I send weekly, and that's the topic that I addressed last week, which is, when do you call yourself a writer? And that's something that I struggled with early on, because I felt like in order for you to be a writer, you have to be published. And it was not even in my wildest dreams to get into a creative master's program in writing. I did not even know that there was master's program in creative writing. So I graduated out of college, and I did not know what my next steps were. I did not even know, this is part of the immigrant experience, I did not even know that there were workshops for writers. I just thought that you wrote and you got discovered. So that's why I used to send my stories to the New Yorker, because I felt like I was deserving. And I did not know that there was creative writing programs until one of my former professors told me, there's this program that you should apply to. So I applied to one and I got accepted. And so that was the most validating experience I've had since like I started my interest in like writing. But who is a writer is a very, very hard sort of space to enter, because in our perception is that you have to be published, you have to have an audience, you have to have like a master's degree, as opposed to like, if I can just put words on paper, even if it is like journaling, and if I want to consider myself as a writer because I'm doing this, then be it. Like, there is no permission that you can seek from no one to become a writer.
So yeah, I agree. It's difficult to get to that point where you want to call yourself a writer, or where you allow yourself to call yourself a writer. And I think I especially felt it when I was going from calling myself a poet to calling myself a writer. Like, writer felt heavier and was very connected to being published. And still, you know, I'll tell someone I'm a writer, and they'll be like, oh, like, where can I buy your novel? Like, what's your novel called? And it's like, I'm not there yet, but I am still a writer. And yeah, it's difficult when there is that expectation. But also something that someone said to me is, I think they just asked me like what I did, and I was saying, oh, like I want to be a writer. I think this is when I was like still in school, and they were like, want to be a writer. If you're a writer, you're a writer, like, always. And it's just who you are. It's not like something you want to be, which is like heavy, but also validating. It's like, it doesn't mean you have to have a book out in, you know, the bookshops. It's part of who you are. It means you're a storyteller. It's you. So I think writers should be calling themselves writers earlier than they are, because it usually takes everyone some time to be like, oh, have I done this? Have I done that? Have I proved myself? When really it doesn't need that proof.
What is your editing process right now? And you can talk about poetry or your fiction.
My editing process, I think with both, it does consist of reading things out loud and hearing it. Even as I'm writing, I do a lot of reading back. This is also why I do the free writes, to try and get out of my head and just keep going, keep pushing forward, because I'm very much a circle back and check and change. But yeah, reading things aloud to see what feels awkward, where I stumble, what's unnatural and clunky, so that can be changed. Sometimes taking time away from a poem or a story and then coming back and looking at that to edit again. But I tend to be quite spare in my first drafts of things. So I do a lot of adding description and adding imagery, and reflection kind of comes as a secondary thing. Plot and dialogue kind of comes first for me. And then I add on to the world of, if I'm thinking about fiction, the world around it, what we're seeing, all the little details come in after that. But yeah, also refining. So yeah, editing, I feel like, is a little bit of both, of like cutting down and refining and adding texture.
Rakaya, thank you so much for coming to Hazawi Podcast. I really, really appreciated our time here. The conversation was very, very insightful, and I'm sure people will find it so.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a really great conversation. I'm looking forward to reading your work as well.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
That's it for this episode in Hazawi Podcast. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and extracted valuable information and lessons to apply in your own life. To make sure you don't miss the next episode, sign up to my newsletter in the link below, where I also share books I'm reading, writing tips, and quotes I'm pondering, and much more cool stuff. And do not forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay creative, and salam.